We are back recording. So we're going to start off looking at the shield. What is probably the core weapon in period Viking Age kind of combat in a weird way. One of the things I sort of discovered, and this is something that most people who have explored Viking Age combat basically say, is the shield ends up being kind of the dominant weapon or the dominant thing you need to understand until to understand fighting from the system, because it has such a tangible effect on the other weapons. And this is even, in a lot of cases, this is including people like myself who come from a single weapon background, where we're like, we're used to single sword and then supplementing a single sword with an offhand weapon, and then you're like, actually, the thing that does most of the work is the shield, and then the weapon you pair it with kind of feels more like the offhand weapon in this regard. So the shield I'm using, just a simple round shield with a center grip. Something that came up before I started recording again was that a lot of the war gear used in the Viking Age was the same across Europe. So the Anglo-Saxons would have been using this kind, or certainly were using this kind of shield. You see similar shields all throughout, through Francia, Germanic, like the Germanic kingdoms, really throughout Europe for really up until the end of the Viking Age. And a lot of the and pretty much all of the weapons that I'm going to be talking about today were equally used by other cultures. So, I just kind of use Viking as a shorthand because everyone knows what I mean. Whereas if I start talking about the 10th century round shield, that gets a bit less obvious what I mean to the average person. All right, so for this, I pretty much do just a normal L stance, same stance that I do for all of my fencing. Honestly, this is one of the two most common stances you see for martial arts around the world. The other being like a more sort of forward-orientated boxing style stance. But I find certainly throughout a lot of medieval martial arts, this is the stance they use. And when you've got a shield, it's a really good, useful stance. The shield itself is held, I like to put my thumb along the grip here because it gives me a good sense of where the weapon is in space. And I can actually use this, use the grip as kind of a way of feeling where the weapon is, almost like I've got a stick in my offhand that is then projecting the shieldy bits out from it. And I find thinking of it that way gives you a greater sense of how this thing moves than, trying to imagine the whole shield. So the shield is held forward. I want my rim along the center line. When my opponent has a shield of their own, I want my rim facing their rim, or I want my rim facing forward so they can't hit their rim against my flat. The reason for that is basically with my hand in this big long stick, I've created basically a swivel or like a hinge. And so if I get smacked to the side like this, my shield's going to turn in my hand. And because the shield is so big, there's so much leverage that no amount of grip strength will stop that. But what does stop that is aligning so that my edge is facing forward. And if my opponent does try to hit forward, they're going to hit my edge, which I'm holding. And if they do try and hit my flat, if they they hit my flat, they have to aim out here, which means they can't aim at me, which gives me an opportunity to come in and hit them. And when you have partners, one of the basic drills you do with this thing is you move back and forth, and every so often, one of your partner will hit your shield and turn it in your hand. And your job is to simultaneously recover and hit your partner, so that you learn, basically, if people start messing with your shield, to use that as an opportunity to attack them. All right. The shield itself moves in 3 kind of core ways, and then everything else you kind of work out by playing with the shield. As a note, when I hold the shield, I'll actually stand with it held up like this. And there are artwork depictions showing shields held this way, with my forearm basically vertically, because it's a lot more comfortable and it means I can bear the weight a lot better. And when I need to act, I just bring the shield straight down along the center line, forming basically a medium guard with my shield arm. But generally, when you come to this guard, you're not going to hold it for too long because you're going to start acting. And this is going to let you get close to your opponent to do stuff. So shield moves in 3 core ways. The first is what I call the switch, where it just moves to the other side of the body. So if you imagine attacks coming in at my open side, I might have, let's say for sake of argument, I don't have a weapon that I can parry on that side with, which is not an unreasonable prospect. I switch and cover that side with my shield. And then I can switch back. So forward and back. When I do this, I want you to imagine that you're keeping your shield very tight to your body. So if you stick your arm out, so you're making a triangle with your arm and your shield, you're moving your shield along the line of your arm. You don't want to do this where you're doing big wide swings, because it means that you're entirely vulnerable between each position. Whereas if your swing is small, you're basically covered the entire time in some regard, which is very, very helpful because this thing is quite heavy. And moving it to defend yourself is a very committed action. So you want to make sure that you're getting something out of your shield, something out of your shield use constantly. So when you're switching, so just one side, other, back, other, back, other, back, other, back, other. That's just a very kind of normal motion to kind of get the hang of, or useful motion. And if you've got like a weapon, so I'll get my trusty axe, I might, when I want to attack, particularly if I'm wanting to move to one side of my opponent, switch and attack. And that's kind of a cool, just useful motion to get the hang of. All right. The next motion is pressing. So I want you to imagine that your shield is locked on the rim of an opponent's shield. You've got basically this line coming right along here between shields. You want to open your opponent up. So all you do is you switch, you compass your back foot out, so you can see my feet. I compass my back foot out, so I'm now facing with the edge of my shield to the rim of my hypothetical opponent's shield, and I push. I'm just switching out. And when I push, I don't necessarily push straight, especially if I'm trying to make this a very small movement. I kind of arc my shield a little bit. I don't know if that's coming up on the camera, but I'm basically coming in like this, just in an arc, basically to get the edge of my shield on the flat of my opponent's shield, to turn it around and create an opening to come in. So the movement is just really, really subtle. Compass back foot and push. 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 Compass my back foot and push. And this movement, incidentally, is countered by, one of the primary ways to counter this, if you're not really looking to take advantage of your opponent doing it, is you do the same thing back. So my opponent switches, my opponent shifts to press me, and I shift my back foot and press them back, and start sort of jockeying position that way. So just twist and shift. So shift and press. Shift and press. Shift and press. And once more, shift and press. Then the third and final kind of core movement that I find you get with the shield that is quite useful is what I term the reap. So what you do is I'm lined up with my opponent, we've got our shield edge to edge, or along the same line, I'm going to start with my edge facing my opponent's edge unless they give me their flat. If they know what they're doing, we're going to end up there because that's the best compromise. That's a reasonable compromise before one person can get advantage. All I do is I sneak my edge out. So a very subtle widening movement. I bring it out, and then I bring it back, and then I pull it back in. I pull it back in quite aggressively. So I just sneak out and back in, and I'm pushing into the flat of my shield with my elbow, to give myself more leverage to basically pull their shield over. This is a very useful movement as well, because I might, if I'm starting edge to edge, if I'm particularly close to my opponent, I might reap and come straight in and use that to create an opening. And this is also very cool because I can cover my attack with my own shield. They're not going to see it until it's too late, that my attack is coming in until it's too late. The flip side of that is your opponent will do that to you. And that's why it's very, very important to develop a sense of feeling, to develop like basically a bind with the shield. So with this, just reach out. So I reach out and reap, 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 and lots more, reach out and reap. And then the way you learn to use these, if you're taking this and going to be able to start playing with partners and actually trying your skills out, is you try and use one to counter the other. Try and use one to counter the other to get in a position of advantage. So you might have someone who moves out and presses against you to try and turn your shield and create an opening. So what you do is you switch and come forward to try and trap their weapon on the other side and come in that way, or they might press. So you might back off and you might try and reap and get them open that way. Or alternatively, someone might move out to try and reap your shield open, at which point you move and press to take advantage of the fact that they're pulling to then push them and turn their shield, which they might then try and take advantage of or try and turn into a switch and come around and collect your sword, your weapon on the back of their shield, so they've got a positional advantage. And so there's this kind of jockeying for position, this kind of almost wrestling that happens with the shield when you get close enough. And I think it came up a bit before we, between recording, Glimmer, the Viking wrestling tradition. And wrestling was quite important to really all Viking Age peoples and really all and medieval peoples, really up until certainly the early modern period, if not modernity itself. Wrestling was a very important martial art throughout Europe. And I think part of that is learning to wrestle gives you a lot of the feeling and the skill that you need to operate a shield effectively, because it is quite similar. And I learned a lot about using a shield from when I took up wrestling. All right, so that's the core shield. So I'm going to open up to questions now. So I'm just going to quickly check the chat. Let's see. So cool. So I do have a chat. So one's asked, what's the size of shield? My moves are very dynamic. What do you think about movements with bigger, heavier shields? My experience is if you want more dynamic movements, you need a really strong, agile body, or you have to choose more static fighting style. Yeah, I mean, this shield is, it's not the biggest shield. Certainly not the heaviest or the thickest. I mean, there's a long tradition of reenactors having very, very overly heavy shields, but if I can get my big round shield out without completely destroying my outfits. This shield is a little under 1 meter across, and this one is based off the larger shield. Oh, this dynamics are based off the largest shield found. So this one's about, I think this one's about 90 centimeters. The other one I'm using is maybe closer to, is probably a bit over 80 centimeters across. Movements are quite dynamic, I think. Short answer is it's a really good workout. I find, like, I mean, of the things that helped me get used to not just sitting in this guard, between this guard and this guard, and fighting with my weapons and actually using the shield dynamically, was these things, was doing kettlebells. So, just doing, like, being physically strong does help. But at the same time, what I find as well is these movements can be done more explosively. So when I'm fighting with a shield, with a heavier shield, it feels drastically lighter after picking up the kettlebell. I don't necessarily need to do it, just slow like I do for demonstration purposes. It can be explosive. Be careful punching with your shield though. You don't want, if someone's not wearing a proper face mask, this can be quite concussive. These movements can be very, very explosive, and that kind of deals with the weight a bit, and then that turns the weight more into an asset. Does that make sense? I think also, just it depends on how heavy your shield is, what you can kind of get away with. Obviously, my shield, I don't know how heavy that shield is. I've never weighed it, but it's certainly not the heaviest shield I've seen. The other thing actually I found, weirdly enough, was I have seen shields that certainly were heavier than the ones I traditionally use, but they're actually they're tapered, so they're thick in the middle and they get thinned down towards the edge, which is what was done historically. And because as the weight is centered and they're better balanced, they move a lot better, which is just kind of cool. So I don't know if that answers your question. I guess my main answer is, look, try it out. Certainly if you're using heavier shields and you've got opponents using heavier shields, still, try the leverage stuff where you use your, even using your shield to hit the edge of theirs to turn it so you can create an opening, because that can be quite satisfying. But yeah, you can make your movements with a heavy shield more dynamic by making them faster, more explosive, because then the way the shield goes from being a hindrance where you're having to control the weight of the shield to being an asset because you're now using the weight of the shield to displace or to trap your opponent. Does that make sense? All right, welcome. Let's see. So someone's pointed out, like, historically shields were much more disposable than today, potentially thinner and lighter. Yeah, I mean, I remember when I first got into reenactment combat, people used to they used to go out and steal aluminium street signs, and they'd actually put those between the wood and like the fabric, fabric or leather lining of the shield to make them more resistant, but that also made them a lot heavier. But yeah, no, it's like, there was sort of an expectation that shields would break. Although at the same time, there's also things where historical weapons weren't necessarily used as regularly as we use our training weapons today. And you actually do see that with even historical training weapons. A lot of historical training weapons, like Federschwerts, were much thicker and more robust. Had quite thick edges. And part of that was actually making them just be able to stand up to a lot of punishment, because they're being used constantly, like week in, week out. Whereas an actual sharp sword is not used with anywhere near that frequency, even for a professional soldier who's fighting a lot. Sword fights, when you're training, when you're sparring with someone in training, you're probably fighting them for, several minutes. When you're actually fighting with someone life or death, you're only fighting them for like a few seconds before it's over. So yeah, it's sort of, there's a thing where training gear, like the gear we use now for training, has to stand up to considerably more combat than historical fighting weapons should. Are there any other questions before we move on? I'm going to take that as a no, so I'm just going to pause recording.